joining us for this webinar where we're going to take a look at the top 9 ways to optimize the performance of your SalesLogix web and cloud clients. Your presenters today are Scott Weber and Larry Halsrud of Customer FX. And I just want to mention a couple items before we get started. We are going to do this webinar in a little bit different of a fashion because we'll be going through different topics. We are going to ask you if you have a question on the specific slide or topic we're covering, go ahead and put that in the question log, and we will answer those questions at the time before moving on to the new topic. However, you know, anything that you come up with at the end, even if it's related to a topic we covered earlier, we will take some questions at the end too. But just so that we can kind of stay on topic, we're asking you to do that. Your line is on mute, and that's why we ask you to use the question log. But that is all I have, so I'm going to turn it over to Scott so that we can get started.
Thank you, Brianna.
Have that. Yep.
Okay. All right, so hopefully can you confirm you can see my PowerPoint okay?
We can see it now, Scott.
Perfect. All right. And thanks again, everyone. This is, as Bree mentioned, a little bit of a departure from our normal demonstration and Q&A type webinars. This one is really more focused on some of the technical aspects of SalesLogix. So we're going to kind of do it as Larry and I in exchanging information. And Larry is our Director of Support. So he's the guy behind the scenes that's really doing the work as far as helping our customers and clients implement SalesLogix successfully and supporting those implementations. So he's got 15 plus years of experience knocking around in his head. And so I was able to sort of pin Larry down and produce what I think is a fairly organized selection of topics. And I think it's an important topic because it's kind of universal what we have found with our clients, that it's maybe a little bit disappointing for their users when they move from the land version to the web version. It simply doesn't perform as fast as they're used to. But what we found in a lot of our experiences in doing many hundreds of upgrades and implementations of these solutions is that there's lots of things that you can do to make it as good as it can be. I'll go right out and say, though, that it's never going to be as responsive and fast as a land client, although the new version 8 is getting really close. They've spent a lot of development energy on just trying to make that thing fly. And it certainly shows for anybody considering moving up to version 8. I think you'll be really pleasantly surprised there. For today, this is really about the 7.5.4 web release, which is the current release. And by the way, version 8's due out at the end of this month for gold, so that it's right around the corner. But right now, the current release software, 7.5.4, is what probably most of you have. And certainly if you're a cloud client, you are on 7.5.4. So some of the topics we'll cover are specific to that release, but my suspicions is a lot of these same best practices and tips we're going to present today will work for version 8.2, or maybe we'll have some new ones. Okay, so what we find is that overall, to optimize your SalesLogix system, it's been our experience that most of the implementations we've been involved in will benefit from many of the topics we discussed today. And so conversely, there is no, here's the only attempt I'll make to be funny, there's no turbo checkbox. I mean, that would be great and simple if, aha, back here, you know, in the software, I found a turbo button, I checked the box, and wham, this thing just flies. It's not that simple. And it really definitely is a case-by-case evaluation by yourself and your business partner to determine, of the various topics we'll cover today, okay, which ones are going to help me? And the answer probably is, and it is in our experience, that many of the topics we'll cover today all lead to progressive improvements in the overall user experience and performance that your users will get from the SalesLogix web and cloud client. And so with that, we've kind of organized the presentation today into kind of logical topics that we'll move through. I think there's 9 of them or whatever. And so I'm going to kind of pose these results to Larry and ask him to sort of expound a little bit on some of the things we're going to show you here today. Okay, so let's get to the first slide. And the first topic we're going to cover is server hardware. And again, in SalesLogix, if you've ever looked at the implementation guide, it's 70, 80 some pages long, and it describes many, many different versions of how and why to install on hardware. But what it really doesn't come out and do is say, this is best for you. That's part of what we're going to try to hopefully accomplish today is get into a little bit about why would you do one versus the other, and a little bit of under what circumstances does one work better. That's really tough to do because we're obviously broadcasting to a very large audience today. And again, I'll say, everybody is unique and different, and that's where leveraging your business partner can really help you zero in on the best combination of some of this stuff that's going to give you the best user experience. So no turbo button, unfortunately. And SalesLogix can be deployed on a single server. In fact, if you sign up for a SalesLogix version 8 cloud system, and even if you have a 754 cloud system today, your system is actually installed on 2 separate servers that are networked together. Sage announced just in the last few weeks that they also now have a single large server installation option for cloud. And again, that's also a server hardware option that you have for on-premise web, is to implement all the moving parts and components onto one single big box versus multiple servers. And Larry, I'll ask you at this point, can you kind of explain a little bit your feeling about the 2 options and what's the pros and cons?
Yeah, I mean, the main difference really is to spread the processing requirements out to your other boxes if indeed the box you have doesn't have enough power to support the number of users you have. I mean, ideally, you could get by with 1 server to do everything, but in reality, you're going to get bogged down at some point if you have that configuration. I believe the cloud guideline that Sage has just come out with talks about if you have 100 users or less, they feel that a single server that they're setting up in the cloud is going to be adequate for them. And the question really comes down to whether or not it does perform as required. It's beefed up a lot, and that definitely will help. But I mean, that's really what it amounts to. If we look at the number of servers, ideally, I would say just to be, if you have no restrictions on what hardware you can get, I would say if you have 3 servers, and we'll talk a little bit about the components that go on there in a minute here, 3 servers would be the ideal configuration that I would use. And that is not always possible, depending on costs and other things. But so you do have the option of 1, but like I say, 3. I wouldn't need more than the 3 at this point to give you really as good a performance as you're going to get.
Okay, and then the other topic we typically hear, and this is certainly becoming more and more popular over time, is the concept of virtual servers. And we get asked this a lot. Does SalesLogix work successfully on virtual servers? The simple answer is yes, and we have lots of clients who have deployed on virtual servers with great success. What I would say, though, is where we have seen problems with this kind of deployment environment is, and it certainly lends into the first point too, is that a virtual server is simply that. It's a physical box, a computer with RAM and CPU and drives in it, and you can create these virtual environments on that box depending on which software you're using for your virtual environments. that really becomes critical, that that virtual server has more than enough resources allocated to it. And what also comes into play is what we would typically find is that if you're using virtual servers, you're probably already using that virtual server for other virtual environments that are already vying for and competing for the physical resources on that single box. And so it surprises me how often I hear that, you know, I have tons of RAM and a great big CPU and fast drives and everything on my virtual box, but in spite of that, SalesLogix is underperforming, it's not meeting our expectations, only to find out they've got 5 other instances of virtual environments running on that same box, and in reality, that box has nowhere near enough resources available for the lonely little SalesLogix instance that's only getting a fraction of what it needs to be getting to successfully host a SalesLogix web environment. So there's definitely some tuning tricks and techniques that we can help with, and your current partner should be able to help you with, for making sure a virtual server environment is optimized in a manner in which it's not limiting or throttling the performance of your SalesLogix image on that server. Some of the other things that are commonly asked, and I'll say this is right out of the implementation guide and planning guide as well. What about the impact of the hard drive speed? And what about solid state drives and RAM, and how much RAM, and what about the operating system and CPU? I know this probably sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but our opinion is, in every case, more is better. SalesLogix loves resources, and it can, in many cases, become noticeable and a noticeable improvement with very high-speed drives, including the new solid-state drives that are extremely fast read and write throughputs. That's becoming extremely popular for high-power servers. RAM, this is a very inexpensive way to beef up your server hardware. RAM is cheap, and SalesLogix and SQL and all of its other back-end components love RAM, and we find that you really shouldn't short yourself there, because that definitely will have an impact as well. The other thing is the operating system, and we're going to expand on this one a little bit more in the next slide, but even though SalesLogix is a 32-bit application, it benefits from being installed on a 64-bit operating system. Most of that comes from the fact that you don't have RAM limitations on a 64-bit OS as you do with a 32-bit OS, which I think is a max of like 3.5 gig of RAM, where 64-bit can utilize, I think, a virtually unlimited pool of RAM. And then CPU is the other one. Again, SalesLogix natively does not have the ability to address multiple CPUs and multi-threading through CPUs, but the modern operating systems that Larry will talk a little bit more about certainly do have the ability to spread the workload, the processing workload, across some of these quad-core processors and some of the new architecture from Intel and stuff. It does make a difference, even though SalesLogix, again, is not natively using those advantages. Okay, Larry, did I miss anything on that slide, or should we move on?
The only other thing I'd mention, just to kind of keep it clear, the reason that the hardware is so important and the operating system, and the fact that using 64-bit is better than 32, is that even though SalesLogix is a 32-bit application, it runs on 64-bit machine, but the power of the 64-bit gets the operating system out of your way, and it makes it easier for SalesLogix to perform better. And that's really the key.
Yep. Okay, we'll move on to the server configuration, and this is going to speak to kind of where Larry started with the hardware slide, is how do we recommend, or what do we recommend as far as where should the various SalesLogix components reside in a multi-server environment. This really doesn't apply to a single server, because you're going to put all of this stuff on one box. But in the example where we're recommending 3 servers is best. Larry, you can expand on this a bit and explain what you would recommend as far as where to configure these various components within that 3-server environment.
Yeah, the 2 main process hogs, I guess I call them, are SQL. You have to have a SQL server that is allowed to run as fast as possible. I mean, obviously, SalesLogix is a database application. So SQL by itself on one box is typically a good idea. The only thing that we do put with the SQL Server many times is the SalesLogix Connection Manager, also called the SalesLogix Server, that software component. But other than that, we try to keep SQL separate. Again, we're looking for optimum performance. The second server would be dedicated to the SalesLogix web host. And again, that's probably the, well, as far as requiring the fastest machine and the best processing capability, that's a critical component. That's doing all of your communications with the web clients. So again, that by itself. Then the third box is one that is kind of a catch-all for a couple of things. Web reporting does get in the way of the normal web capability, depending upon how much reporting is being done by your users. If they're not doing a lot of reporting, it's not a big issue. But if people are running reports on a pretty frequent basis, it can become a contest for resources if web reporting is on the web host box. So it is recommended that that be on a separate box, so that's the third box. The other component, like web reporting, is speed search, which when you get into the web, speed search is much more critical because it is used for duplicate checking and other things that it was not used for in the LAN client. It definitely can, again, bog down a machine when it's doing its re-indexing, and keeping that away from the web host so that the performance of the web host is consistent is kind of the key. If you have speed search on there, it's going to have a spike where it slows down. Same thing with the web reporting. It'll have a little spike where it slows down because of the other resources being sucked in. So those are the 3 server levels. The very bottom item on the list here, we're talking about additional components such as knowledge sync, exchange link. Those we really would recommend they are on really either 4th box or they go on with web reporting and speed search. So depending again about the amount of usage, how often things run, there's a little bit of a variable there about whether they would coexist well on that, what I call the 3rd server. And other than that, the only other thing is the SalesLogix administrative components, the administrator, the architect, and the LAN client, which still can be used for certain administrative tasks. That really would normally be on a workstation, whoever is administrating SalesLogix for you. It's better, again, to keep that on a workstation rather than bog down any of the servers with that. If, again, you have to keep it on a server and not going to do it in a workstation, the 3rd server, the web reporting and speed search server, is where I would recommend putting that as a second choice. So that's kind of a quick overview of what I would say the optimum configuration, even though, again, you get a big enough box with enough power, you can get all of this in one, and it really depends on how many users you have and the amount of activity that they have going on too.
Okay. Bree, do we have any questions related to what we've covered so far?
I do. The first one I have is, how many web host servers would you recommend for 1,000 users?
That is a difficult question to come up with. I think the the general guidelines before, when the web structure was introduced by Sage, I think they had indicated that single server should handle around 200 users quite adequately. So if you're talking about 1,000, you're obviously talking about getting into multiple web servers. Again, you're accessing the same database, but you're not relying on the one access to the database. And there's other factors than just the number involved, I'm sure, too, depending upon the amount of access. And, you know, if you have 1,000 users and not all 1,000 on at the same time, probably. So I can't give a real example, but you're definitely going to get into multiple web servers with that number of users.
Okay. And then this one, it's kind of in the same vein, and it's the question is, can we walk through a scenario where we have, say, a 50 user versus 150 user? Would you set things up differently for, say, a 50 user versus 150 user implementation?
I would think not. As long as, again, you get a powerful server, 50 users can require an awful lot of processing as well as the 150. So I don't see a real big difference between those levels. And it is, again, it's kind of a subjective thing. It's not, there's no one answer saying, okay, for 50 you have this size and for 150 that size. In that range, 50 to 150, it would seem to me just a nice, robust configuration should be able to handle that range.
Okay.
And I think the key to that, Larry, as you were saying, is that you really have to look at the simultaneous usage, and that's really the determining factor, as opposed to we have 150 licenses, let's say, but we've learned from experience that they're not all in the software at the same time vying for resources. I mean, that could be the case. Every company's different, but that's the kind of metrics that we would want to work with the customer on to help them make the determination.
Okay.
Okay, Bree, any others?
I just had one more come through, and we'll see if we can get this one answered. Can you talk a little bit about the server configuration for the ticketing customer portal?
The server configuration really, I mean, that's a component of the web offering. So I don't see a big difference. It's, again, just looking at the number of users. They're part of the user community on the web server. And if you have, 100 of those plus 100 of your users, they're vying for the same resource. They're going through their same server. And it really is, the considerations are similar. I guess that's, I don't know if that really answers exactly what they're looking for, but typically you don't see.
I'm sorry, I think the answer is the same. The customer portal has to be determined how many concurrent connections are you anticipating through that portal, because when you own the portal license, you do have the ability to have multiple concurrent connections. So that's part of the coaching that your partner can provide is, what is your anticipated load at any given time? How many concurrent sessions does the system need to be supporting? Have to be determined first. And like you said, it would be equal to a named user who's logged in and working on it. And then if you've got multiple concurrent users, that's the same as multiple named users, all again hitting the web at the same time. So it kind of falls into that same category.
I thought the question was customer portal.
Yeah.
Is that what it was, Bree?
Yes, that is what it was.
Okay, so the customer portal, yeah, it's a little different access to it, but again, as you said, it's depending upon the numbers of people coming in.
Okay. I do have one more question here. Would you like to move on to the next and take this more towards the end, or do you want to stick on this topic right now?
We'll keep going here, Bree, and then
okay.
we'll do some catch-all stuff, so bear with us. I appreciate that. Okay, the next topic we want to talk about is database optimization. Our experience has been that the web client is far more susceptible to an unoptimized database than the LAN. It's fussier and requires more attention to detail when it comes to making sure the actual database itself, the SalesLogix database, is highly optimized to function in the web environment. So Larry, you can kind of address some of your experience here based on this slide for us.
Yeah, again, this is a topic which can take a while, so we're going to kind of touch on the surface just to give you a feeling for the areas to look at. When we talk about indexing, depending upon how long you've been using SalesLogix, if you're brand new to SalesLogix, your indexes are probably not in too bad shape. Likewise, your data is probably not in too bad shape. But if you have been using SalesLogix for a while, your indexes very possibly are out of date and should be looked at to make sure that they are optimized to quickly find the information you need. One example which we frequently run into is, let's say, your history records. If you're using opportunities or tickets in fairly large numbers and you're trying to find the history for, let's say, for a particular ticket or a particular opportunity, either way, if you don't have an index on the opportunity ID or the ticket ID, it's going to have to sequentially search for that. The standard system does not have an index on those two fields, and adding that can make a big difference. Again, if you have a lot of tickets, a lot of opportunities. It's that kind of a thing where if you're getting data out of the system and you don't have the proper kind of indexing, the retrieval of that data can be quite slow. And it is, again, it can be sensitive in the LAN also, but with the web is just a little more sensitive to that. The integrity checking, I guess here we're talking about two things. There's a SalesLogix integrity checking, which really is looking at the data related to how SalesLogix needs to process it and needs to enter, needs the linkages and so on to work out. A lot of times people do not do the standard SalesLogix integrity checker on a regular basis. So this is just something pointed that really should be run on a very regular basis because it will correct issues that seep into your database. So that kind of integrity checking is really important if people aren't doing it. SQL configuration, I figured what we were really talking about here, Scott, I think this was just saying, taking a look at your SQL, again, depending on the resources you have. The one area would be if you are in a single machine with everything, you don't want SQL to use all of your RAM, which is very possible that it could suck up all of the RAM, and therefore the web host wouldn't be running very good if SQL is using all the RAM. So you can throttle that down. You can put a setting in there to put the maximum number or maximum amount of RAM that's used by SQL. So it's that kind of a general configuration thing that we're talking about.
Well, the other concern we have here is you can have a very strong, robust SQL server and a highly, I'll call it optimized SalesLogix database, but we will also find too that customers will have multiple SQL databases that are running other back office applications that, depending on how you have optimized your specific SQL implementation, you can find that the SalesLogix database is being starved for resources because there are other databases running on that same box, which is certainly allowed, by the way. SalesLogix is fine with that. We don't need a standalone SQL machine for SalesLogix. It can be shared by other SQL applications, but we've, again, through experience, have found that performance issues could be related to overworking that box with chores unrelated to SalesLogix which are gobbling up the resources at different times. And so that's another thing we check for.
In the last item on here, really talking about maintenance, good practice again with SQL is just you do periodic maintenance so that it can keep the database as healthy as possible. But then there's the internal data of SalesLogix, which really is just not either, there's data missing, let's say, that there may be fields that are blank or null that the web is expecting to find a value in. The LAN client didn't expect to find a value. There's some of those things that you can run into, but typically that will cause some problems, and it may be bad enough that it's obvious what's going on, but there's sensitivity, so keeping that kind of data cleaned up. And also then if there's old data in the system, the larger the database, obviously, the more power it takes to process it. And if you can get rid of, 5-year-old history records, if you got, again, an old database that's been around a while, those kinds of things should be looked at, just again to keep things as streamlined as possible.
Bree, any questions on those slides?
Yeah, I do have a couple here. The first question I have is, how long does it take to index and optimize?
It can take a while. There's some easy ways to approach it. Sage does provide some new SQL scripts which do add new indexes to the database, and I would encourage you to take a look at those. The simplest thing is to run those scripts and see if that does improve things. The long answer is that if you really want to do it right, you look at every single index that you have in your database and you decide, do I need it or don't I need it? And that takes a while. So it's really a question of what you're going to do. And it's not a real simple task, but like I say, if you're not aware of the scripts that Sage provides, you should look. They're actually on the installation materials that Sage has. There's new ones for 8.0, but there's also a script for, I think it came out in 7.5.2.
So Larry, why wouldn't I turn on indexes for everything? If indexing makes it faster, why not put an index on every field?
Well, indexing does require overhead to maintain and keep the index going. If you don't need it to find your data, then you don't need that overhead. Plus there's a space issue. If you have too many indexes involved, they all take room. But it's more that, that it's really for fast lookups, and there are only certain fields you're really going to be doing lookups on. So just to keep the database optimized, you don't want to just throw them in there any more than you need to.
So when you talk about a lookup, I think everybody knows what that is, but couldn't an index also benefit, for example, a one-to-many tab like a sales order tab or something that's got thousands of rows? Can you index the data returning from a tab? Because isn't that, in essence, doing a lookup when you click on it?
Well, when you're talking individual record, by the time you have the record, it's got an ID with it, and IDs in general are all indexed. So I mean, there are indexes on really, I'd say every table. You should have at least one index, which is the ID. So once you know that I want this record, the ID is immediately pointing to the right record in the database for you. But other than that, I'm not sure, Scott, I'm relating to what you're asking there.
It's kind of a rhetorical question because, like you said, over-indexing is sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul, because that puts more of a workload on your SQL box, which is attempting to maintain these indexes, which is competing for resources versus the live client interaction.
I have a couple more. Would you like to take them? I think one.
Yeah.
Okay. Could you repeat which fields on history need to be indexed?
Well, the two that we typically will add are indexes on the opportunity ID and the ticket ID. Those are two fields in the history table. Now, if you don't use tickets, then obviously having that ID is not indexed, is not important. Hopefully everybody is using opportunities, so that one is more general as far as the requirement for that one. But those are the two that we will typically add.
Okay. And the next question is, which tables and indexes other than history are most often in need of optimization?
Any table with a lot of data in it. that's kind of a cop-out. But if you think about the, you've got your accounts. Depending on how many accounts you got your contacts. History is usually the biggest table in the database because you have multiple records for each contact and multiple records for each account. But it really is the larger tables. And again, as we said, almost there are indexes in every table, and most of the time the indexes that are there are probably all right. But there are new indexes that have been added by Sage because when they looked at how things are performing with later levels, they're performing different than they were in the old databases. And if you've just been upgrading a database, you're not really getting the new indexes, the new index structure, without doing some direct SQL scripting, which is what they're providing.
Okay.
Larry, what about custom entities or customizations that somebody's added? They've added, a project management solution or something. Should that be considered for proper indexing also?
Yeah, I mean, really every table should be looked at, especially if it's custom. You're completely in charge of that. Sage is not going to know about that, and their standard script is not going to help you with a custom table. So if you have a good developer who's created the customizations, they're going to be putting indexes where they feel they're needed. But depending upon who developed it, they may not have really indexed everything they needed to.
Okay, I have one more question on the subject. I think it should be pretty straightforward, and then we can move on. Are there any restrictions or limitations in any of these areas when you're in the cloud environment?
Limitations or restrictions. I'm not quite sure what they're driving for there.
Well, I would assume, Larry, they have access to the cloud SQL instance, and so is Sage enabling the customer to apply their own indexes or manage their own indexes even though they don't own the box?
Yeah, the database is really your database as a customer, and what we're talking about is affecting your database. So you can do everything to that database that you want to. It's really not controlled in it. The access is provided to you.
All right, I think we're ready to move on.
Okay, next up is workstation settings. What I can add here is, and this does come from Sage, who we've worked with a lot, especially when the web client in the cloud first came out, 7.5X, whatever. We were underestimating the amount of workload on a workstation. And I think our customers maybe fall into that category too. SalesLogix is not just a web site. It's not like visiting Amazon or Google or something where you're just browsing somebody's website and they're doing all the work on the back end. There's a lot of JavaScripting and a lot of client-side interaction that's putting demands on the workstation. And again, of all the things we've probably talked about today, this is probably the most underestimated area of a typical implementation that is focused on. And so a lot of the things we're going to say here are similar to what we said about the server itself. Is the workstation using, you know, a modern Windows operating system, and what impact is a Windows 7 64-bit versus 32, the CPU power and RAM available in the workstation. A lot of times it gets used on a laptop, and maybe that laptop's 3-4 years old. It's got 2 gig of RAM or something like that. The more is better, and I know, again, that's sort of a blanket statement, but we have found that a lot of the workstations are severely underpowered, either through specifications or because the user has multiple windows open at one time. Every application you run, every browser session you open, everything you've got running at once is all competing for those workstation resources. So even if you have a powerful workstation, if it's already being taxed by all kinds of other software running, that is definitely going to negatively impact their experience with the SalesLogix client. The other one that we run into is internet bandwidth availability, and this sort of maybe seems like common sense, but there's a lot of data moving back and forth between a workstation and a SalesLogix machine. And so this is another thing where we typically will recommend the customer upgrade their internet connectivity and make sure their LAN is working as well as it can. And then we're going to expand on browser choices a little bit too, because we have definitely found, and this is confirmed by Sage, that the browser you choose can have a significant impact on the overall performance. Anything you can add there, Larry?
The only thing I guess I'd mention is, you know, this is a tough area to really know the impact. Bandwidth can be tested, and most of you are maybe, you know, aware of that, but there's a lot of internet speed test sites that you can go to, and it'll at the moment tell the workstation user, you know, what is your speed connection. They have test sites you go to. It's a good idea to use that if you haven't, to see just what is the bandwidth and the speed that you're getting at any particular time, especially if a particular workstation is having a problem and let's say nobody else is having a problem. It's really one of the first places to look and just see, are they really being held back because of the speed of their connection. And so just mentioning that those tests are out there, and most of you are probably aware of them already, but they should be used.
Okay, Bree, any questions on that one? We're going to talk about browser choices and specific configuration settings on the next slide for workstations.
Okay, then I think we might be able to answer this question that came up. So we'll go through this and then see if that question is still left unanswered.
Okay. Larry, I'll go ahead and let you take it away. You've got the most background on this topic, I think.
Yeah, just looking at browser recommendations. At this point, our experience is Firefox is always faster than Internet Explorer. And we're, depending upon what version of SalesLogix you're working with, Firefox is restricted, because if you want to do the desktop integration, you've got to be able to speak to Firefox. So that's somewhat restricts what you can do. The 7.5, SalesLogix 7.5 versions require Firefox 3.6 in order to really be able to do the full desktop integration. And that's very old, obviously. It can still be downloaded, but it is faster than Internet Explorer. I think the new 8.0 is going to support Firefox 10, which again is not the newest level, but it is a much improved and faster version. So Firefox for speed is faster, and it's recommended if you match the integration required versions. IE8 and IE9. IE9 is faster. You can see a big difference between i8 and i9. I'm not remembering i9 is not fully supported though for, again, the 7.5 version, I don't believe, as far as desktop integration. I don't know, Scott, is that right? I forget which one is which, but I think that's correct.
Yeah, that is correct. Even though we have lots of clients who use it successfully, and sometimes you have to use the compatibility mode of 9 to get the screens to render properly, we've never really pinned down exact circumstances under which one works versus the other. It seems to be a bit of a hit or miss, but you may have to shift IE9 into compatibility mode, which makes it backwards compatible with IE8 JavaScripts and other components that SalesLogix is attempting to use.
Yeah, and the desktop integration piece, I believe the only thing that really doesn't work is mail merge. The word interface is busted with 9, and you get it with 8. So there are considerations there. So the officially approved for everything that you do in the web is IE8 and Firefox 3.6 right now. And the next version of SalesLogix 8.0 is IE9 and Firefox 10.
Yep, version 8 supports Firefox 10 and IE9 fully. Still not Chrome, although some people love Chrome. It's very fast, but it's not going to work properly, like Larry said, with your desktop integration, and some of the mail merging functions won't work successfully.
And really, as far as settings, I mean, there's setting information available in different locations. I guess the main thing is, if using Internet Explorer especially, there's lots of security settings which can kind of bog you down and cause intermittent errors when you're in the system. The whole idea of being a trusted site for Internet Explorer is very important, and having a low enough security setting that indeed you can run all of the scripts that are required to be run without generating any kind of errors on different pages that you run into. Firefox also does have a trusted site kind of a setting which should be utilized. The same kind of reason to give you rights to everything that you need to do. The multiple windows is really just saying, if you get, if you're using the browser for SalesLogix and you also have about 3 or 4 other websites open, you're kind of taxing the resources, and again, you're sharing resources with your SalesLogix processing. So just think about, look at how it's being used, and ideally you would only be using SalesLogix on the browser when you're using SalesLogix. And the idea of a cache, if things start slowing down, there is a general fix, which is go ahead and delete the temporary cache, the internet cache, and that can many times take care of the issue. I know that also removes some save settings and so on that people might again have to rebuild, but considering the addressing that is worthwhile if things start slowing down, and they were working okay in the past. A lot of times it can be that your browser is just getting bogged down and overloaded with extra things that they really doesn't have to be there. That's about the only thing I can think of here, Scott. I don't know if you have anything else.
Questions on that one, Bree?
I do have. I'm going to save a couple for the end because we are getting tight on time here. But I do have one that I think would be appropriate. Is how do you know how fast the bandwidth needs to be?
You don't know how fast it needs to be. It needs to be as fast as possible, which is, again, just not a good answer, I know. But if the higher the bandwidth, the faster everything's going to work. If you test it and you see that you're really running a low bandwidth, and again, low is relative, but that is something that many times can be increased fairly easily. Again, it depends if you're running from your network, you're running to your network, you're running from your home. If you have a lot of people with business offices and and they have a very slow provider. Those are the easiest ones to address probably if you need to look at your connection, your network connection to the internet. There is no really right answer, but if you look at it and you're getting a 1 megabit per second type of connection or less than that, I'd say that's probably a too slow to be comfortable. I don't know, Scott, what your experience is with that. You do a lot from your home office too, I know.
Yeah, it's that would be kind of what I would consider to be well below the threshold of where you're going to see a noticeable improvement in performance with you know, a 3, 4, 8 megabit per second connection. It's going to be pretty speedy. Where 1, yeah, would be you're really almost unacceptable performance at that point, I would say.
Okay, I have one more before we move on. Is that all right? Okay.
Yep.
Is there a place to get the recommended list of settings for IE9?
There's some information, in the, well, that implementation guide is not out right now. I assume Sage has something posted, Scott. I don't know if you've looked up there on the customer portal to see what they have, but I believe they do have something up there.
I think they do too.
I guess we'd have to find that out and maybe post that information.
Yep, we can do that. We can do that. We'll
it's
put
not
a
in the document yet.
Yep.
Since it isn't fully supported right now, it hopefully will be documented in the documentation coming out with SalesLogix 8.0, but I think there's probably some online information right now.
Yep.
Okay, let's move on to the next topic, and we can revisit these questions later.
The next one kind of deals with SalesLogix web site tuning, and we're really speaking about the fact that the website itself is running on IIS, which is a service that's part of the server operating system, of course, and there's definitely some things that impact performance there, positively and negatively. So, Larry, I'll let you kind of address these bullet points.
Yeah, a lot of it is, if you look in the SalesLogix implementation guide, you will see a lot of information about setting up the web, and the first bullet here is intended just to say, really take a good look at what's there and make sure that you're meeting the requirements and the specifications is set up. Once you get it set up and everything's running good, you don't have to go back and make changes to it, but it's just something that it's really important. There's just a lot of different things. A couple of the things that they talk about as far as performance, I'd mentioned the compression, HTTP compression. That's intended to help you if you do have a real slow connection in general, low bandwidth. You can compress the files that are coming to the client, but there is a trade-off there, which is it has to compress and uncompress the files, which takes CPU resource. So that's one that normally it's better to increase your bandwidth because the CPU resource is typically a little more scarce. But there's a trade-off there that they do talk about using compression, and that's one, again, you almost have to try it to see if it helps, but it's a difficult area. The expiration, we talk about content expiration. This is an implementation guide. Again, they do talk about what you have to do to set up the HTTP so that it will cache on the workstation. And the whole idea is here that if you can cache a page on the workstation so it doesn't have to be retrieved every time you want to go to that page, it's going to be a lot faster. So the idea is to cache as much as you can there of the items that can be cached. And they do explain how to do that, and that's something that probably is put in place, but if you haven't looked at that area, you should. Related to that, we talk about caching, the IIS reset and the server reboot. One of the problems that everybody experiences is right after you do an IIS reset or reboot your server, which does the same thing, the IIS, the SalesLogix clients, or the SalesLogix web server, I should say, it has been caching the pages, the images that are going out to the workstation, and that gets wiped out and it has to recreate those caches. And that happens only when you actually go to a particular page. Let's say the first time you log into SalesLogix after you've had a reset, then that login screen will take quite a while to come up. First time you go to the account details screen after a reset, it'll take a long time to come up, but it's again just the first time, and then once the cache gets built up, everything's back. The reason we mentioned here is that performance is really in the eye of the user, and this can be very, very, I guess, negative as far as the user's impression of how SalesLogix works if they're not aware that something's going to happen and that things are going to be really slow because you're going to do a reset overnight just to reset IIS, which, by the way, is something that Sage has recommended in the past, that it automatically does do a reset every evening. The negative of that is that you get the slow retrieval first thing in the morning when your early users get in the system, and to them it's a very negative experience, and it kind of in general says, well, SalesLogix is not performing well, especially if they don't know it. So I guess the reason we mention this is just if you're going to be involved in a reboot or an IIS reset, it'd be definitely worthwhile to send out an email notice to all your users just saying, you know, first thing tomorrow the system's going to be very slow until you get the caching done, and then it'll be back to normal speed. That can help alleviate that kind of a negative impression from the user community. Other tuning, multiple websites we kind of touched on already. If you have a lot of users, you may need to get into multiple websites. The other one I just mentioned, antivirus software, that indeed can slow things down, and again, this depends upon the power of your server. And if you experience CPU, if you take a look at your CPU performance and how it's going, and you see spikes in there, it may indeed be your antivirus is looking at some of the SalesLogix files, and that indeed is slowing things down. So you can perhaps exclude certain folders from the antivirus live work, and that would improve it. But again, this is primarily a situation where your CPU is being overtaxed, and you can kind of tell that's going on by kind of reviewing it. So that's pretty fast, but that's kind of main points I guess we just want you to be aware of in here.
Yep, and the antivirus is not just talking about like attached files. If it's not configured to ignore the folders that are holding the SalesLogix web pages and the website itself, it's going to recognize every time those pages change, it's going to assume that's a new file, which it is, and it's going to run its course. And we found in some of the first cloud implementations we did that it was so overtaxing the server, it almost made the SalesLogix environment unusable. I mean, it was virtually unusable because it was spending so much time examining every time a user made a change or any time something was deployed. It was doing its thing against those looking for viruses, and it was a huge hit on the server. And it actually took us a while to figure out what was going on here, and actually Sage changed the cloud environment based on our discovery. So this exact same thing could certainly be happening on your web server if you have antivirus software on it, which you probably do, and you haven't configured it to exclude the files and folders that SalesLogix is continuously updating as users use it. Okay, Bree, any questions on that slide?
You know, I think what we're going to do is we'll finish these slides and then take the questions at the end so that people
Okay.
who want to see what else we have to say can see
Okay.
that and then drop off, and then people who want to stay for questions can, all right?
Perfect. Okay, next one is SalesLogix settings. And so these bullet points, we can just quickly browse through those. These are some other factors that we've run into multiple times that are impacting the performance of the actual SalesLogix client. And the big one is groups, especially if you've, as Larry had mentioned, if you've upgraded and been with SalesLogix for a number of years, you've gone from the LAN to the web. We found clients with quite literally hundreds of groups, account groups and contact groups and so forth. The web client is severely impacted by too many groups. And so one of the optimization exercises we would encourage you to do is get rid of groups you don't need. Even though you may not be displaying them or they're not showing up on your tab bar, if they're there, SalesLogix client has to reconcile all of that every time you land on one of those entities. The other big one is merge templates. We just had another client with severe problems with mail merge templates. It literally would time out if they would, try to do a mail merge, and it would time out and literally stall their system out indefinitely because it couldn't reconcile all of the merge templates. So again, we encourage you to look at that, get rid of any merge templates you don't really need, and make sure that they're organized and released only to the users that use them. Don't release them to everybody. And make sure they're organized logically in folders and so forth so that it's not having to reconcile hundreds of merge templates that are, irrelevant. The other one we'll talk about is general screen design and tab designs. There's definitely some best practices in play here that our developers use to make sure that the actual design of the screen, too many fields, not enough fields, move fields to tabs, and what kind of scripts are running behind the scenes every time I land on a tab. We've run into a lot of that too, where there's some global script or some local script on the screen. Every time I land on the account detail view, there's 10, 15 seconds of delay. And what we've discovered is there's some background processing happening that was part of a customization that's quite literally hogging, all the resources of the machine as it tries to reconcile all that. So these are just some common sense things I think you can look at. And also in the design of tabs with one-to-many data, you have some choices about whether you have paging turned on versus presenting a long list, a continuous scrolling list. There's some best practices there your partner can help you with. Other things we found is, again, the web client's very sensitive to data anomalies and nulls, as already mentioned, and things like that. We found implementations where, we've started working with a new customer, and every time we land on a certain screen or tab, an error pops up. And we say, well, how long has that been happening? Well, for 2 years. So we're like, well, so you've lived with this pop-up error because nobody spent the time to figure out, well, why? Why is there errors coming up and goofy things happening that are, broken? And maybe it doesn't overall degrade the performance, but it certainly is an irritant to the users who have been told, live with it, get over it, and just click the X and exit out. And then finally, attachments can also be a huge bottleneck, especially for cloud users or users connecting to an on-premise through the internet. What happens is if you create a document on your workstation and you attach it to the attachments folder, it has to literally copy that file through the internet and place it on the attachments folder on the SalesLogix server. And then if you retrieve that document later, want to bring it up and edit it or look at it, it has to pull that document across the internet again. So you're literally uploading and downloading through the internet every time you attach and then view or edit your attachments. And we've had customers who didn't understand that and couldn't understand, well, why is it taking so long for me to work with attachments? Aren't they just right there on my local drive? And the answer is no. It may have started there, but once you attached it, in SalesLogix, it copied it to the central site, which then has to be retrieved. Anyway, just a common sense thing that we've run into that might help to explain a little bit. Okay, the next one is some user configuration optimizations we've seen. Again, what you can do is this talks about minimizing the amount of data that a user's workstation has to reconcile and churn through as you navigate from screen to screen. One of them is account ownership. It's quite common that in SalesLogix implementations that every record is owned by everyone. Nothing wrong with that, except that I don't maybe as a user need to see all 50,000 accounts or contacts in my database every time I land in that area of the software. So you can greatly optimize the performance by limiting or putting into place limitations through account ownership and the releases of groups and reports and templates where it maybe wasn't an issue at all when you were on the LAN client and everybody was on a local network, let's say, but once you go to the cloud or have remote users connecting to an on-premise through the internet, now all of a sudden all this data that's being asked to be filtered and churned through and presented back on lists and groups and lookups and things like that severely can limit the performance a user would experience. So we would encourage you to take a hard look at exactly these kind of optimizations that can put a smile back on the face of your users. And then finally, the reports server itself kind of goes back to the previous slide. Look closely at the number of reports that are released to your users. Oftentimes there's dozens and hundreds of reports that, over time you've kind of accumulated in your implementation. So again, we would highly suggest as a way to optimize that area of SalesLogix is to unrelease a lot of the irrelevant reports or reports that not every user needs to see or access, so they don't have to wait for those screens to come up with the big old list and then have to filter and search and find these things. So that all gets back to just unreleasing stuff that not every user needs all the time in an effort to slim down the data return. Reports themselves, we can also find, can be really slow in the web client. So you pick your report, you've said open the report, and it sits and grinds away trying to assemble this report, and users are wondering, well, why? Why is it taking so long for this report to formulate and present itself back to me on the screen? Same logic applies here. Make sure your reports are optimized and maybe pre-filtered to only include data sets that are relevant to that user, and also utilizing the pre-filter options that are part of the SalesLogix interface in that reports area. Okay, so a tremendous amount of content we covered today, and we certainly can't dig into every nook and cranny of it all, but we're hoping to at least give you some food for thought here after today's presentation. Bree, is there any other questions that have yet to be answered that we should address?
We do have a few, and some of them we might just have to get to offline. One question is, will SalesLogix ever be compatible with Chrome? Do you think that that's on the horizon at all for Sage?
To my knowledge, no. They're aware of it. It does function in Chrome as far as the interface, but the desktop integration and the mail merge functionality does not work with Chrome, and I have not heard of any intentions on the product roadmap to make it compatible with Chrome. It doesn't mean it won't be. I just haven't heard of that.
Okay. Do you recommend reverse proxies to speed up client access?
Larry, I don't know what that is. Do you know?
No, I'm sorry. I don't relate to that question.
Okay. Well, maybe the asker, if you could give us some more specifics, we might be able to get to this before the end of the webinar. Let's see. I'm going to go back to one that we skipped right in the beginning. And the question is, how do you optimize on VM, which I'm assuming is referring to virtual machine. Any pointers?
Yeah, there's lots of virtualization software, and the answer we would give is dependent on exactly which virtualization package. VMware is certainly one of the biggies. There's also built-in virtualization right inside of the Windows Server operating systems. And so depending on which software package you're using for virtualizing machines, they're going to give you the ability to tweak and configure and set up how the resources of the host box are divvied out and prioritized. And so our general response is, if you're using VM type software that has prioritization and the ability to reserve resources for a specific instance, then by all means reserve as much as you can afford to the SalesLogix server. As much RAM, as much CPU, and as much drive throughput that the software will allow you to configure. And you will have to experiment with this, because the overall horsepower of the host machine comes into play here too, not to mention all the other VMware instances that are vying for those host resources. So it really is kind of a proprietary or custom solution that your partner should be able to help you with in setting up those configurations.
Okay, another question. Have you had problems with DNS settings? We have users on VPN from home that seem to have problems with DNS settings on occasion.
Larry?
I guess I'm not real sure what exactly, the details of what's involved. It's quite variable. I mean, I'm not sure. I think we'd have to have more details to really be able to give you any kind of an intelligent response on that.
Okay. What can you do to keep the reports server up?
Did you say to keep the report server up?
That's, yes. And I'm not sure if we're talking about speed.
That's going to be tough to answer too, because we'd have to know why it's not up. So my assumption is that there's some trouble for this customer, that they're having that report server go down.
Yeah, I looked at it came in underneath. It says sometimes it hangs.
Oh.
Yeah, I think there's something that we were going to mention here in general. The idea that Sage really is quite active in releasing updates, formerly called hotfixes, for the web, and they continually address the different kinds of things. There have been a couple of different fixes addressing web reporting. Whether they really would address the exact problem, or if they're really experiencing something unique, that's really what is kind of hard to tell. But in general, it has been a problem in the past. I think with the latest version of 7.5.4 through update 5, that's the very latest update that's been released for the web, I think that it works pretty well. Some of the earlier versions were having issues, and there's been fixes kind of scattered throughout the other 3 levels that came through here. So you have to kind of look at the level you're on, and then I think go look at the documentation on the updates to see if maybe what you're seeing has been addressed.
Okay, I think you guys, we need to call this a wrap. We're a little bit past our scheduled time, so we do have a record of all the questions that came in, and offline